Amen. Thank you. If you have your Bibles, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. If you have one of those booklet things, we're on page 8. And we'll be looking at page 8 and page 9 today. And if you need a booklet, you only need raise your hand. I think there's one or two left. Nice, small, tight group this morning. This is going to be fun. So we looked at last week. We got into chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. And Koheleth is taking a turn here to look at vanity in religion. Namely, the oftentimes evil that takes place in worship. And that ought to really, really perk our ears up as we are all here currently today at this time to worship and every day. We looked at, he gives us 4 commands and 4 reasons for those. We're not going to spend any more time on the first command, but that drives everything else. Draw near to listen to God, to listen what he has to say, to be impressed with him, rather than to offer up our worship. And our tendency, if we're really honest with ourselves, I think, is to flip that backwards. We're going to offer our worship first instead of drawing near to hear what God has to say. Of course, we can look at so many examples in the Old Testament, how dangerous that was for many people. But the next reason, the next command that he's going to give is in verse 2 and verse 3. I'll just read those. Don't be hasty to speak. Do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. For dreams result from much work, and a fool's voice from many words. I read another rendering, a translation of verse 3 that went like, many words mark the voice of a fool, which makes a little bit more sense here. This is the Holman Christian Standard Version. Can you think of some ways that we can speak hastily before God? The Bible doesn't say, don't talk before God. That's not the idea. What we're seeing here is vanity in religion. In other words, offering to God, first not coming to him to hear what he has to say, doing what we think. Can you think of any ways that we would speak hastily before God? Yes.
Could prayer be one of them? I know when
It's got to be.
Empty words into our prayers and maybe throw words of wisdom.
This whole section is like just one ice pick to my forehead. Prayer especially. How often do we get up, we say prayers, we mentioned last time. I realize women aren't leading prayers before this assembly, but you do in your own groups and in your own life. I can just tell you as a man how many times I've got up and thought about all the things that I needed to say, whether it's here or anywhere else, and not once has my conscience actually made contact with God. What a shame. It's just words coming out of the mouth. Our entire, and any church, collective worship, it can go the same way. We can make a lot of noise, but not actually draw near to the one who we are to be. And that happens very easily. What are some other ways that we can speak too hastily? Yes, Ryan, and then Jenny.
Nick's class on the grumbling in the wilderness, when they feel like their needs aren't being met or satisfied, they forget all the great things that have already happened to them and start their complaining.
Okay, good. I asked that question poorly. What are some ways that we can speak hastily in worship? Worship. Yes, sir.
Making a vow that you don't think about, commit something to the Lord, but you haven't thought about actually fulfilling it.
We're going to get to that shortly. That's his next command. Very good. Any other thoughts on in worship. Some of us have trouble saying more, and some of us have trouble saying less. All of us have difficulty saying the right thing. And there's also a great danger and tendency for those who are teaching to speak too much. Just a fun little story. Myself, first person I can ever remember, quote unquote, teaching the Bible is Jeremy Muchnick about 8 years ago. And I can tell you I learned vastly more than he ever learned from me. One of the things that I learned was I talk way too much. And if you get to know Jeremy, he's an extremely interesting person because he doesn't talk a lot, kind of like Dad. Actually, the two of them could talk pretty decently, but you know who I'm talking about. Some of us, we tend to just talk too much. And there'd be a few times where he'd just interrupt and say, "Can I just say something?" And it was one of the best things that's ever happened to me. And to this day, if we're in a Bible study and he's there, I'm better off because I'll tend to talk too much and not listen. I realize that's not as far as in terms of worship, but it's no less. Can you imagine how God feels when we're doing all the talking and none of the listening? Dangerous, dangerous. I had some more notes here. They're not very good. I'm just going to read something that someone else worked a lot harder on and helped a lot. Think of the example of Ananias and Sapphira. They come before the apostles. We sold a field for this much, and they both in turn drop dead. God isn't messing around. When we say that we're going to do something before him, and every Christian that heard about that afterwards realized, wow, this worship thing is not like anything else that we've ever been a part of. We're dealing with the Creator. He doesn't tolerate funny business. But notice this, and I'm reading here, "Let not your heart utter anything hastily before God." The preacher is telling us there's a real tendency to come into worship and get a temporarily emotionally based repentance. In the midst of worship, it's not uncommon to get the twinge of conscience that says, "I'm not living the way I ought to be. I believe I'll quit that." The preacher's point is, God hears that. He knows what you're saying even in your heart. Therefore, be careful about what you say because the Lord will require it of you. Think about the songs we sing. How often do we say, "Send the light"? And what are we doing about that? How are we growing in that way? We're saying words and we're not doing them, which brings us to the next point. Verse 3. When you make a vow to God, don't delay in fulfilling it. He has no delight in fools. Fulfill what you vow. So here we go. Make a commitment to God. The preacher doesn't say, if you make a vow. He says, when you make a vow. God expects us to make vows. Now that's shocking to me because I've grown up reading Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, talking about making vows, and concluded, okay, don't vow anything. Otherwise, if I break it, I'm in big trouble. But that's not Jesus' point. His point was merely just do what you say. Let your yes be yes and let your no be no. Instead of having to make this big elaborate oath just to get people to believe you. If you and I aren't ever saying we're going to do anything before God, how would we ever grow? The point here is we need to follow through with it. Now, can you think of any important vows to God that we can and should be making? Scripturally. Yes, sir.
We shouldn't have no other gods before him.
Very good, Ian. Can you think of more vows that we can and should be making to God?
Some of the vows that descend from the marriage vows, things that we have together with our spouses, even not with our spouses, even Hebrews, I think it's 13:4, that talks about let the marriage bed be held in honor. Everyone's supposed to be listening to that, not just the married folks, but everyone should be looking at marriage as a very high covenantal place.
Okay, anybody married here? Yeah, you have made a major vow before God, and I have too. We better keep it. Anybody have children here? You and I have a major commitment to God to raise those children in a godly way. Think about any of our spiritual walk. I need to grow. I need to pray more. I need to do all these things. We're telling God we need to do these things. We recognize these things. It's important that we follow through. This is not a good stereotype, but young people are often making rash vows, and older people not making any vows, neither of which should be the case. We need to, when we say we're going to do something before God, follow through with it. Baptism. We are committing our lives to turn from that point forward, and many, many other examples. So we do make vows, which again, surprising to me because I'm thinking, that some sort of cross my heart, hope to die. No, we're saying what we're going to do in the presence of God, and then that brings us to the fourth and final point. Fulfill what you vow, or he will destroy the work of your hands. And I think this has got to be my least favorite point. Doing what we say we're going to do. When I think about this idea, I just want to crawl in a hole and never have to say that I'll do anything. And we don't often think about it at the time, but when we say we're going to do something, when it comes time for us to do that, we don't know what the circumstances are going to be like when it's time to fulfill that. Just a silly example. Neighbor passed away about 6 months ago, lived next to him for the last 10 years. Older gentleman, couldn't do much. And at one point I said I would take his car in for an inspection. And he had it in his mind when that was going to take place. And in my mind, it was just, yeah, I'll do it. That was really hard. That was really hard because I didn't do it when he expected me to do it, and it wasn't convenient for me at the time. We must be very, very careful saying when we're going to do something and following through with it. Just an example from the Old Testament, King Zedekiah, in Jeremiah, the 34th chapter, he makes a covenant to free all their Hebrew slaves in the 7th year, which they were supposed to be doing. But later changes his mind, him and all his officials, they take their Hebrew servants back. God sends Jeremiah to Zedekiah and says, I'm proclaiming you freedom. Freedom to die by the sword. Freedom to die by plague and famine. God isn't messing around when we don't follow through with what we say. He's taking this seriously, and we need to be as well. Which brings us back to this important point in chapter 5. Oh, how careful are we when we come into the house of God? Better to listen than to draw near and offer the sacrifice of fools. We are going to need to be working on that the rest of our life. It's a great challenge, and we have to be helping one another with it. But what a powerful, powerful message. Final thoughts on chapter 5 before we move into, 5, 1 through 7, yes.
So one of the phrases here that really sticks out to me is it's a mind focus. We are focused on God because He is in heaven. I'm going to cast all my cares on Him, not venting in a way because I just want to get this emotion, this feeling out. But I'm casting my care upon Him because He's either going to help me endure it, He's going to carry me through it, or He's going to fix it for me. And when I can give that to God, then my care is taken care of, and He's going to give me that strength.
That's right. And in no way, shape, or form is Koheleth saying, don't say anything before God and don't worship. That is not the idea at all. The New Testament, the Old Testament, absolutely. Peter, cast all your cares upon Him. He cares for you. The idea is how much vanity takes place in worship, of all places where it shouldn't. Because he's going throughout life in these first 6 chapters and showing us in each and every way why he arrives at his conclusion in chapter 1, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And here we see it in the house of God. Great, great danger and warning to those of us who do serve God. Of course, we have excellent examples in the Old Testament, Nadab and Abihu, many others who bring what they feel is the right offering before God. But so many different things we could talk about in that discussion, but very, very powerful lesson. Now, we come to chapter 5 and verse 8. We're going to look at this next section as going from verse 8 all the way to the end of chapter 6. The end of chapter 6 is an important landmark because chapters 7 through 12, Koheleth is not going to focus as much on the vanity that he sees under the sun. He's going to focus primarily on how we can live wisely and with joy under the sun, despite the vanity, which is when I just go, wow, this is just what we need to hear. This is why this book is so encouraging. As we talked about before, oftentimes we think it's the opposite. It's a discouraging book, on the complete contrary. But here, as he arrives at the end of his search of vanity, it's very interesting and telling what subject he's going to talk about. He's going to talk about wealth. That should not surprise us greatly. Couple comments here. We're going to go through this. We're going to take 5-6 minutes. We won't be talking other than we'll be looking at the text. I'm just going to help set this up really briefly. The Bible does not ever condemn people for having wealth. It's for loving wealth and the desire for more of it. That is what causes man to sin. Personally, one of the most chilling texts to me in all the New Testament is the parable of the soils. The good seed, which is the Word of God, falls on 4 types of soils, and one of those soils is called thorny ground. The problem with the seed is it's choked out. Matthew and Luke say it differently. One says the Word is choked out, and the other one says we are choked out. The thorny ground is still believer, still Bible-carrying people, church-going, good people, but they don't ever mature. Do you know why? Because they're concerns of this life, riches, and pleasure. And it kind of struck me, we don't usually talk about those 3 things in a negative light. They're usually talked about as some form of good. I'm so busy. I've just got so much going on. We kind of view that as a good thing. Oh, I can't imagine how much you have on your plate. That's just a necessary part of life, right? It's not too often that we talk about riches and pleasures in any kind of negative light. But Jesus says it's these 3 things that cause the thorny soil not to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, Koheleth is going to spend an entire chapter talking about this. Furthermore, the New Testament repeatedly warns against the danger of desiring riches. Listen to these words from Paul to Timothy. 1 Timothy 6 through 10. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Does that sound at all like Ecclesiastes' message? For we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. Those who want to get rich fall into a temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And skipping on down to verse 17. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. That's literally a quote from Ecclesiastes. Command them to do good and to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so they may take hold of eternal life. As we mentioned, Paul doesn't spend a lot of time explaining how vain the pursuit of riches is to help convince his audience, but Koheleth is going to do that. This is why Ecclesiastes chapters 1 through 6 are some of the most important texts in all the Bible to help us to see the vanity. I'm persuaded we don't walk around thinking, yeah, I know this is empty in this world, but I'm just going to pursue it anyways. No, we think we're going to get some sort of gain. We think there's some fulfillment out there. So let's take 5 minutes, go through this, and then we'll talk about it. Chapter 5, verse 8 to chapter 6, verse 12. Okay. We're back on. I want you to see maybe kind of what we could call the progression of the preacher's discourse on wealth. He's going to have about 5-6 areas, give or take. We're going to go through this. There's a lot here. So if you can, just try to be brief with your comments just to give other people more time. But so much here to talk about that we could never do justice in one class. Let's take a look at verses 8 through 9. What do you see? And by the way, if you had something you want to say, please make a mark of it or a question. When we get there, please ask it or bring it up. Verses 8 and 9. What's happening? I'm sorry? Yes. Government takes everything. That's right. I love that he starts with this first. Fact number 1 about wealth. The government has it all. It's theirs. Yes?
Kind of related to that, there's damage done to others. It's at our expense. There's going to be oppression of the poor. Justice is going to be perverted, so they're going to do things illegal to get it. And then they're going to protect each other.
Yeah.
So there's so many wrongdoings to maintain that power and that wealth.
Absolutely. I just love the timelessness of this message. Corrupt government, by the way, Solomon he'd only be able to have himself to blame if he's actually literally writing this book. But we've got a couple powerful reminders here. And number 1, God, if you remember, told Samuel to warn the people in 1 Samuel 8 when they demanded a king. Listen to what he had to say. Listen carefully to what he will claim as his own. This is God talking to the people. He will take your sons, he'll make them serve in your army. He'll take your daughters and make them perfumers, bakers, and cooks. He'll take your land, he'll take your food, he'll take your servants, he'll take your cattle, he'll take your donkeys, which is an old way of saying he'll take your money. God warned them of this. It's never been any different in any age or any country, which is point number 2. Don't be surprised. And perversion of justice is top down. But we need to remember, ultimately, everyone answers to the next person above them, and the king, the president, whoever it is, answers to the one who's in charge. So they can't get away with it forever. What encouragement can we glean from this text? Yes.
Temporal justice and all injustice is temporal. Eventually, it's taken into account.
Absolutely. Yes, sir?
I think we have the capacity to look around and see what's happening and think, man, if only God knew about this, he'd take care of this. But the encouragement that I get, and of course that's not right, but the encouragement I get by seeing it right here in black and white, way back in the Old Testament, is God knows about this. Not only does he know about it, he tells us, don't be surprised when we see it. This is one of those timeless things that was happening 3,000 years ago, 4,000, and it's going to continue happening. It's just in the nature of man, and so it doesn't, circumvent the other promises that God has made to us. Like, there's a popular saying that the Lord giveth, and the government or taxes take it away, and we say that jokingly, but I prefer not to joke like that because it seems like when we're joking like that, what we're saying is that the government's ability to tax us circumvents God's ability to take care of our needs. And that's just not the case.
And look at verse 9. Hey, the government they are served by our work. They're served by the fields. You know what? They can only take so much or they'll shoot themselves in the foot. Any good government will find just the right amount to tax. Otherwise, if they take everything from us, we have no incentive to work. They make no money. It's great. Simple economics. Don't be surprised. Verses 10 through 12. What do you see here? Yes, sir.
All throughout this passage we're reading, but especially verses 10 through 12, you say on the board, wealth cannot satisfy man, but I see what we need to strive for, what we need to learn to do is be content with the things that we do have.
That was a question that I had. What is it about the worker in verse 12 that allows him to sleep so peacefully? What is it about the working man?
I think it follows up with whether he eats little or much. He doesn't seem to care whether he has a lot or little.
He's content. Yep. Beautiful, beautiful picture. This is a central message to this entire text and a grave, grave warning that the Bible warns of over and over again. The one who loves money is never satisfied. And why is that? Well, all we have to do is look at people who have a lot of money, and what are they doing? I just need a little more. I just need a little more. If I could just get a little more. Now, I can tell you, especially for myself, but I think for all of us, we like to think we can cheat verse 10. Yeah, that's true, you know. But whenever I get that house built, whenever I get this, I'll be good. No, you won't. No, I won't. We can't beat the I love wealth game. It can't be done. How would you explain verse 11 to someone else? Yes, ma'am.
When you have more money, you spend more.
Excellent.
And when you have more blessings, it comes with more responsibilities. So
Absolutely.
never-ending cycle.
Yeah, so what are we doing driving ourselves crazy, wanting, if I could just, like the example of the teenager, if I could just get a car. You know what happens when you get a car? You got to pay for the car. You got to pay for the gas to go in the car. You got to pay for the maintenance on the car. You got to pay for the insurance. Your cost just goes up. The more you have, the more their cost is. So it's a dangerous, dangerous game. And we're just seeing it one-sided completely. He's saying, no, the greater the profit. And then look what happens. You're looking at the balance sheet. And all you get to see is, the profit there. Because first, the government's got to have their cut. Insurance, maintenance, upkeep, all these things. All the good it does is you can see it with your eyes, and that's it. It's gone. So exceptionally dangerous. Okay. We're going to keep moving. Verse 13 through 17. We have another scene here. Can you describe the scene that's happening? What's happening? Yes, Maria.
I think it's really centered in verse 15, where it's basically saying you come into this world with nothing and you're going to leave with nothing. I
Okay.
think that's pretty much the gist
Okay.
of verses 13 through 17.
Tell the story really briefly. What's going on? 13 through 17, in your own words. So basically, you have this man, right? Yes, he is wealthy, but he keeps his wealth, and it's to his own harm. Something happens somewhere along the lines. I don't know if the stock market crashes or what, but he loses his wealth, which is a lesson in and of itself. If you have wealth, watch out. You can lose it. Just because you have it doesn't mean you keep it. But he's richer because he keeps it to himself. You know, friends cost money. He's got one kid, which is better than 3 or 4. That would be way, way expensive. And he's focusing on growing this pile of cash, but he loses it. Now he has nothing but sorrow, sickness, and anger. In the 16th chapter of Luke, Jesus told a parable about an unjust steward. It's a challenging parable to understand, as all the parables are challenging to understand. But he said that a wise man, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm summarizing, wise man knows it's not a matter of if you're going to lose your wealth or your 401k or your American funds. No, it's simply a matter of when. The wise person knows money's like the wind, just like the wings on the back of a dollar bill. It always flies away. Better to live like the unjust steward, but intentionally use our unrighteous wealth in this life, knowing it's going to fail, and planning and setting ourselves up for eternity. Creating eternal relationships with our wealth. He says, one who is faithful in very little will be faithful in very much. If you are not faithful in unrighteous wealth, then why should God entrust you with riches? True riches is what Jesus says. And then he goes on to say, it's not either or. I'm sorry. He says, it's either or, not both. You can't play the game of loving God and loving wealth. And that's what we so often think. I can still love God and still enjoy riches. Good. Okay. Verse 18 through 20. Whew. Puts it right in the middle. I guess Koheleth knew what a sandwich was. The better way to deal with wealth. What do you see? By the way, how many times have we seen this theme in Ecclesiastes? Sorry, Ryan.
I love the ending, that it's joy. And you look at the other situation, specifically the lone man, and you contrast that with vexation and sickness and anger. He's doing a really intentional job to show you the emotional side of this too. It's not just that the bank account is empty or the bank account is full, but that there's real emotion that's tied with these.
Good. I think this is the 4th time that he's talked about this idea of eating and drinking being the pinnacle of enjoyment that can take place under the sun. But notice now, what's different this time than in times past where he's talked about this? It's a gift of God. Remember, we saw that in chapter 3:4. A gift is something that's given. It's not something earned or taken. To a man that God has given riches, he's allowed him to enjoy. God is the one that gives wealth. Do you see someone who's rich? What do we typically say? They're so brilliant. Look what they did for themselves. No. God allowed them to have that wealth. Whether or not they realized it is an entirely different matter. God is the one that gives us wealth and allows people to enjoy that. The important thing is a righteous man, only a righteous man is able to enjoy that wealth because he knows who gave it to him and because it's not what he seeks. Verse 20 is simply incredible. If we won't forget and understand that a gift given today is not a gift given tomorrow. That sometimes we may have wealth and sometimes we may not. Then we're able to truly have joy because we know God is the giver regardless. It's like the seasons of life that we went through in chapter 3, which are, terrifying because I can't pick. I'm going to go through all of them. We don't know what's going to happen with our life, these ups and downs, but God's our true source of joy in eternity with Him, so we can be happy with whatever He's given us. And if He decides to give us wealth, we can enjoy it if it's a lot, medium, or a little. I apologize, we're out of time, and I apologize for the people that we couldn't get to. We will finish chapter 6 next week, and then on to chapter 7.